Good morning. Welcome back once again to our journey through the Gospel of John. We are currently getting ready to venture into John chapter 4, where Jesus meets with the woman of Samaria at Jacob's well. But we're taking a bit of a detour right now to review some of the past history and religious practices of the Samaritan people, because that's going to be an important variable that we need to understand as we look at the conversation between Jesus and that woman. So we started down this path last week, and I'm optimistic that we will finish that up shortly here. We have first taken a look at some of the geography of this region known as Samaria. We talked about the fact that there's this capital city of Samaria. The name of the city is Samaria, just as the name of the region is Samaria. There are two prominent mountains, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and there's a fertile valley that extends between those over towards the coastland. And this is part of that fertile region of ancient Canaan and modern Israel, which was promised to the patriarchs. A lot of Old Testament history, as we have seen, has been focused on these areas of Shechem and Shiloh, where Shechem was a place where many of the patriarchs settled. Jacob bought land there, he dug a well there, he buried some of the household idols there. The town of Shiloh was especially remembered for the fact that the tabernacle was housed there for almost 4 centuries, according to the writings in the Talmud of the Jews. And that was during the period of the Judges, before the tabernacle was moved to Jerusalem by David, and then the temple was built by Solomon. But what we have tried to identify here and focus on is the fact that Samaritans have this history. It's not a pretty history. There's a lot of division, a lot of warfare, a lot of infighting, and there's a lot of movement of people. That's something else we've tried to trace. We saw that the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, really came from the upper Mesopotamian basin, and they emigrated into, this region, with Abraham first receiving his promise from God at the town of Shechem. We talked about the fact that once the nation of Israel had divided into 2 separate portions, the southern territory of Judah and the northern territory of Israel and Samaria, once that occurred, then their religious practice went in 2 very different directions almost immediately. That King Jeroboam in the north set up his rival priests, and he set up places of worship right here on the border and then also all the way in the north, so that his people of the northern kingdom wouldn't have to cross into somebody else's land to worship, even though that was what God had commanded to them, that everybody was supposed to go back to Jerusalem. So we saw the movements of the patriarchs into this area. We saw the movement of some of the faithful people left the reign of Jeroboam to escape back to Jerusalem, where their worship was more legitimate. And then we saw that eventually in 722 BC, this land was taken captive by Assyria. Many of the individuals were taken off to Assyria, and they essentially are lost to history from that point forward. In their place, the Assyrian king sent other Assyrians back to populate this area of Samaria. He even sent some priests and things to do worship of the foreign gods of Assyria, and he also sent at least 1 priest of Israel who had been deported as well. He sent 1 Israelite priest back to honor Jehovah. Then 150 years later, the southern kingdom of Judah is taken captive by Babylon, and they are similarly taken off into captivity. But unlike the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom of Judah retains its identity while in captivity, and they do that through the development of the synagogue. And the focus, instead of being upon worshiping in Jerusalem, because that's not available to them, they can't do the sacrifices, they can't make their offerings at the temple. So instead, they trade that for preserving their community through the synagogue. And the synagogue becomes a place where their history, their heritage, their religion are all celebrated. And they begin studying the law with great intensity. And that intensity persists all the way up until, of course, the Pharisees, especially of Jesus' day. Okay, so that's kind of where we are right now. We have gotten to the Babylonian captivity, and then under the kings of Persia, the exiles from Jerusalem and from the province of Judah begin returning to Jerusalem. And that's under the directorship of Ezra the scribe, who uses this as an occasion to remind the people of the importance of following God's law. And you can see that, you can see this in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Meanwhile, Nehemiah becomes the functional governor of Judah, and from Jerusalem he oversees the reconstruction of the city, which had been utterly destroyed in 586 by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And so Nehemiah is overseeing the construction and the reconstruction of the city, and particularly the city walls, to protect the city of Jerusalem. And as he does this, he faces some great opposition. One of his enemies is a guy named Sanballat. And Sanballat turns out to be the guy who is currently governing for Assyria up here in Samaria. So Sanballat, who has been here for a little while, is watching as the Jews return from Babylon, and he doesn't like the fact that they are now rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. And so he becomes Nehemiah's, essentially his enemy, in trying to get these walls reconstructed. And you can read about that in Nehemiah chapter 4, especially verses 7 and 8. There's also in Nehemiah, you can read in chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, you can read that Sanballat made an attempt, it looks like, to have Nehemiah killed. And it was thwarted because Nehemiah didn't follow through with some suggestions that had been made to him by Sanballat. So Sanballat said he wanted to have a meeting, and Nehemiah discerned that there was danger in that situation, so he just didn't show up. There was something else that happened, though, that sort of sealed the deal between these two nations. And this is from history. There was a high priest down in Judah. So this is a legitimate high priest from the tribe of Levi. And this high priest was named Eliashab. Eliashab married Sanballat's daughter. Well, this was a problem because intermarriage was strictly forbidden. And Sanballat was not even a purebred Israelite. He was what was known as a Horonite, or one of the native peoples of this region. So they were pagans. And so the high priest of Jerusalem marries this rival governor's daughter. And as a result, he was expelled from the priesthood. Even though he's the high priest, he was expelled from the priesthood and he was exiled. When he got up in Samaria, which is where he decided to settle, then Sanballat appointed him to be Samaria's high priest. And he built a temple for him on Mount Gerizim. So now we have a rival priest, a rival temple, a whole rival system. Okay? And this is how things are going now as we speed towards the first century. Okay, so now we have looked at the period of the kings, the United Kingdom, the divided kingdom, the fall of Israel to Assyria. We've looked at the fall of Judah to Babylonia. We've seen them return from Babylonia, and this division, instead of getting better, just gets worse as far as Samaria versus Judah. And now we get to this time period that we really don't have any biblical record of at all. There's a period of about 350 years where the Bible is silent up until the days of Christ. Well, what happens during that time in this region? Well, by and large, this is a time, it's kind of pathetic for this area and for the Jewish heritage. Judah and Samaria both end up serving just as battlegrounds for the regional powers. And the regional powers in this time are Egypt. Of course, Egypt's located down here, and Syria. Syria is located up here. And so you can see that with those two being in conflict with one another, the battleground is usually going to be somewhere involving either Israel or Judah. And this is what that 300 to 350 year period is like, is just one side will attack them, then the other side will attack them. Well, during that time, Judah does have a couple of heroes develop from the Maccabean family, okay? And this is the time then when the Maccabeans lead Judah in a revolt trying to gain their independence from both Egypt and Syria and to be by themselves again and not under domination. However, Samaria decides to align themselves with Syria in these wars. So once again, Samaria is at war with Judah in all of these skirmishes. And then in the course of that going on, in the course of all those battles, this temple that had been built on Mount Gerizim was destroyed in about 128 BC by one of these Maccabean leaders. And so during one of these battles, they destroyed the temple of the Samaritans that was located on Mount Gerizim. Okay, then the next important thing that happens on the world historical stage is that, of course, there's a power growing up in this region, and that power is Rome. And ultimately, this whole area comes under the domination of Rome. And you can remember the types of alliances that occur between Egypt and Rome. That's when you get into all the business about the Emperor Octavian or Augustus, and then also the rulership of Mark Antony and Cleopatra down in Egypt. Well, that's the time of history we're talking about. And Rome comes to dominate, of course, this whole portion of the world. And both Judah and Israel fall under Roman control. One other thing that happens during the Maccabean period that you need to realize is that during the course of all these battles back and forth, Judah actually is able to conquer some of this area of Samaria's up around the Sea of Galilee. And that's why when you go to a New Testament map, you see a southern zone of Judea, which is legitimate Jews. You see a northern region of Galilee, which are legitimate Jews. And then you have this no man's land in the middle, which is Samaria. Okay, that's always been a question for me, is how in the world did the legitimate Jews get back up here? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple of minutes. But that summarizes a lot of what we've dealt with as we lead into the first century. Herod the Great, who is a puppet king basically of the Romans, but functionally overseeing all of what's now known as Palestine. He rebuilds this city of Samaria, calls it Sebaste, which is the Greek word for Augustus. So he builds a city in honor of the emperor, and he names it for him, but also he builds him a great palace there, and he builds a temple there, a temple to worship the god Augustus. So we see even some Roman influences coming into their worship. So as we get to John chapter 4, and we encounter this situation between the Jews and the Samaritans, let's summarize what the situation is like. First of all, the political situation, the geographic situation. There are three main divisions now, and we're back to our original map that we've been using most of the time. There are three main divisions of first century Palestine. There's Galilee in the north, Samaria in the central part, and Judea in the south. Judea is the center of traditional Judaism. And of course, the real focus is the temple in Jerusalem, which has been rebuilt. And also Herod, in order to curry the favor of the Jews, has embellished it remarkably. The temple in Jerusalem, as Herod reconstructed it during this massive reconstruction project, the temple in Jerusalem was a true beauty. It was a true architectural wonder at its time. Okay. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, the sacrificial system has all been restored. That had to go away when the Jews of Judah were in Babylonia. So the sacrificial system has been restored. Herod the Great has undertaken a massive reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem, but they have retained this intellectual and religious snobbery that we talked about, that developed while they were in this period of captivity. And the search was to find, okay, who's a true Jew? Who fits the criteria of being in the right lineage, and who follows the law the best? And those were the criteria they were looking for. And this intellectual snobbery creates the environment of the scribes and Pharisees that we read about throughout the New Testament, and that opposed, in so many regards, opposed Jesus. Okay, that's the south. In the north, you have progressive Judaism, but it is Judaism. And this is, in many ways, Galilee becomes the trade center. Jerusalem's isolated. It's not close to a coast. The Dead Sea is dead, as it says. Galilee is alive. The Sea of Galilee is a sportsman and fisherman's paradise. There's the coastal regions. And this is a central area of the trade routes that crisscross the areas. There was one major trade route from the east that came down through this zone, followed the coastline down to Egypt. And then there's also a trade route coming across from Greece that you could come by ship and then grab the main trade route off to the east, or you could come down by land through what's modern day Turkey and then down through what's modern Lebanon into Galilee and catch that route off to the east. So Galilee was an important trading cosmopolitan area. The trade routes came through there because there was a lot of commerce and a lot of international dealings. Greek was the language up in Galilee, not so much down in Judea, but people up in Galilee would very commonly know Greek, and especially those who were engaged in some of these international relations issues. So these people up in Galilee were viewed as legitimate Jews, but they kind of had a secondary status compared to the real, thump your chest Jews down in Judea. You can recall that, and later in the Gospel of John, we will see comments like, no prophet ever comes out of Galilee. Okay, so there's still this snobbishness that even extends to legitimate Jews. Judea is the conservative foothold for Judaism. Galilee is more the progressive wing. Okay, but then we've got Samaria in the middle, and Samaria is relatively isolated. You can see they just don't have the same sort of access to trade that the Galileans do. The people who live in Samaria now are illegitimate. They have no claim to being pure Jews or true Israelites. They cannot verify pure Jewish ancestry because there has been too much movement of people in and out of the area. They are a bunch of half-breeds, really. There's a racial mix between the northern kingdom of Israel, the historical northern kingdom of Israel, the Assyrians, who some of the Israelites went up to Assyria, and some of the Assyrians came down there, so there was all kinds of intermarrying. And there were the native Canaanites, who were there even before Abraham came to the area. So you've got all these different groups living in the area, and Samaria becomes cosmopolitan, much in a way that the United States is like. Okay, so you've got movements of people in and out, plus you've got a native people who were there originally. And all of those things just sort of mix together over time. And that's what you're dealing with in Samaria. In the eyes of a Jew, that doesn't count. You don't rate. You don't have any legitimate claim to anything, whether the land or whatever. Okay. Aside from the political situation, though, a question that's relevant is what was first century Samaritan religion like. Okay? And it was a strange mix. It was indeed a strange mix. First of all, it retained native Canaanite practices. So this goes all the way back to the pre-Abraham days. Native Canaanite paganism. These are the groups that when the Israelites moved into the promised land, God said, destroy them, get rid of them, but they never did. And so they continued to be there. And their influence, just as God had said it would, their influence continues to be felt now, millennia after 2,000 years after Abraham first came into the area. They continue to deal with the native Canaanite practices. Then there's also Eastern Assyrian influence. You remember those idols, those household gods that I told you to remember when Jacob had his family members bury them in Shechem before they went to build an altar down at Bethel? You remember those idols? Well, those idols actually were resurrected, not dug up, but the ideas of those idols were raised in the course of Samaria developing its own worship, and they began to celebrate and worship some of those Assyrian gods that had been buried back in the days of Jacob. Meanwhile, then, a few centuries later, a big portion of northern Israel is deported off to Assyria, and then the Assyrians move in, so there's all this influence that's intermingling. And so Assyrian religion and Assyrian paganism and Assyrian, idolatry comes into play in their religion as well. You've also got Roman influence. So by the time we get to the first century, Samaria is under Roman rule, under Roman governorship. The capital city has been named for a Roman emperor who now believes he's a god, and a temple has been built there. And so we have the Roman influence. So all of the mythological gods of Rome are involved in this, even to the point of some degree of honoring and worshiping the emperor. Okay? And then finally, we still have elements of Judaism. Some bits and pieces of Judaism have been preserved over the centuries up in Samaria. One of those areas was temple worship. Okay? You remember that I told you that a temple had been built at one point on Mount Gerizim, which was later destroyed. But they viewed their region, the Samaritans viewed their region as being the appropriate place for worship because that's where the patriarchs did it. That's where Abraham and Jacob built their altars initially. Okay? And that's where Jacob owned land. That's the area that was favored and given to Joseph's sons. Of all the 12 tribes, the ones that got that land were the favorite sons of Jacob. Okay? Being Joseph's children. The tabernacle had been housed at Shiloh for almost 400 years. The altars and the ceremonies all started for the Jews in the Shechem area originally, not Jerusalem. And so the Samaritans viewed this as though the tribe of Judah had sort of stolen all of the headlines from them. And they thought that the Jews were illegitimate in that they had stolen it away. And it all started with King David, that King David had taken the capital, moved it away to Jerusalem. He built the temple down there and then established this priesthood and this lineage that, essentially neglected the Samaritans. And so they did not accept what had happened during the days of David. And it's interesting that with this temple worship and their emphasis upon sacrifice, the only place where sacrifice today is made to Jehovah in the world is still in Samaria. To this day, they sacrifice for Passover. They do animal sacrifices. So, and you can find that if you look it up on the internet. It's kind of fascinating, really. But they continue to practice animal sacrifice, even to this day. One other element I want to mention to you that they preserve is partial preservation of the scriptures. The Samaritans accept a version of the Pentateuch, of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the books of the law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But they do not accept any of the books further than that. They do not accept any of the history. They do not accept any of the prophets. They do not accept the wisdom literature, because those are coming, in their minds, those are coming from the wrong sources. People that are trying to build up the case for Judah being God's territory and God's place. So they only follow the Pentateuch. And it's interesting that they actually have changed some little pieces in the Pentateuch. Another thing I told you to remember was about that worship on Mount Ebal, and that Moses was told when he reached the Promised Land, he should build an altar on Mount Ebal, which actually Joshua did because Moses didn't enter the Promised Land. But nonetheless, if you take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 27, that's the place where Moses receives this instruction. This is 27, 4 through 6. Deuteronomy 27, 4 through 6. God speaking to Moses says, "And when you have crossed the Jordan, set up these stones on Mount Ebal as I command you today, and coat them with plaster. Build there an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. Do not use any iron tool upon them, and build the altar of the Lord your God with field stones, and offer burnt offerings on it to the Lord your God." That's the way the Bible reads, but the Samaritans have changed it. They say that this was to be built on Mount Gerizim, and they've changed that in the text. And so that way, when they set up their seat of worship on Mount Gerizim, they are just following God's command, but they've changed the text. The other thing that you need to see is that even though the Samaritans did not regard the prophets as legitimate, nonetheless, they had a view of a prophet that was yet to come. And this comes also from Deuteronomy. We've talked about the verses before. You remember when John the Baptist was out in the wilderness, he was asked, "Are you the prophet?" Well, that's the prophet that the Samaritans also are looking for. The prophet, according to Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, says, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me," like Moses, "from among your own brothers. You must listen to him." And then skipping down to verse 18, he sort of reiterates the same thing. "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything that I command him." This, in the eyes of the Samaritans, is a statement that there will be somebody like Moses who will come later on. And we're going to see in this encounter with Jesus that the woman mentions this and understands this and believes this, and Jesus makes a claim to be exactly that person. Okay? So that's kind of where we are headed. So what's the net effect? What's going on in first century Palestine between the Samaritans and the Jews? There is great animosity and hatred between the groups. And it's rooted in both their history, all of the warfare, all of the division, all of the different directions. but also their religious practice, because it has taken on such a different direction. The Jews, in one hand, have gone to this emphasis on legitimacy and picking at gnats, while on the other hand, the Samaritans have gone off in a completely different direction and have really just bastardized the religion, for lack of a better word. It has no roots, it has no continuity, and Jehovah is just one of a menagerie of idols and gods that they claim to worship. Because of this type of animosity, it meant that if you were a Galilean and you were traveling down to Jerusalem and you decided to go through Samaria, that was not an easy trip. It was typically a 3-day journey, and along the way you had to usually carry enough provision. It was hard to get Samaritans to sell or give you food, and also you usually were sleeping out under the sky because you couldn't get lodging. It was a difficult, arduous journey, to the point that it was quite common for many Jews to just simply skip Samaria, go over into the region of the Decapolis and then down to Perea and cross back in order to get to Jerusalem, and of course reverse their tracks to go home to Galilee. Samaria was a difficult place. This also magnifies the effect of a parable that we all know very well, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And you see this type of hatred between these people, and you realize that Jesus is saying the good one in the bunch was the Samaritan, not the priest, not the Levite, the one who came to the need that was before him, the one that responded with his heart was the Samaritan. And Jesus commends him for that, and we do too. And so that is the type of animosity that existed in the first century, and it hasn't changed a bit. When you think about the Arab-Israeli conflicts and also the especially the Palestinian-Israeli conflicts, that's all rooted in this same history. That's where it all comes from. There's one group of people who's claiming a legitimate claim. We have a legitimate claim to the land, and there's another group of people saying, no, you don't. And it has not changed in now 4,000 years. All right, this brings us actually to start into the text of John chapter 4. I went a little over last week, so I'm not under, but I'm right at, and I'm gonna call it quits for today. We will pick up next week with the text of John chapter 4, but I hope that you've gained a little bit of understanding for the differences in these peoples. And the Samaritans are not people without a background. They're prideful people. They're proud of their heritage. They're just mistaken about it. But they are very proud of it. They're proud of the relationship that they have with the patriarchs and the earliest roots that Israel has with the land of Canaan. And they take great they have this national identity is focused on that. It's focused on their past and their history, because their existence in this day and time is really kind of meager. So they focus so much on the past. And this woman's going to ask some questions of Jesus, saying, okay, tell me the differences now between you and us. What's this all about? Okay, and that's where this conversation with Jesus is going to go. So I look forward to sharing that with you starting next week. Don't forget, God is good all the time. Have a great week.